The truck shuddered to a stop, its metal frame creaking like a tired animal. Dust billowed in the Kansas heat, turning the morning light into a golden haze. Inside the truck bed, the women clutched their small bundles, blinking against the sun as though they had landed on a foreign planet, which, in a way, they had. Liesel pressed her hand against the rough wood slats and inhaled sharply. There it was again, that smell. It floated on the air, rich and heavy, curling through the dust, meat frying somewhere nearby. For a dizzy second she thought she must be imagining it. The war had trained her nose to expect smoke, sewage, gunpowder. This was none of those things. This was something decadent, forbidden. Beside her, Marta gave a sharp, incredulous laugh that was almost a sob. "Bacon," she whispered, as if naming it out loud might make it vanish. The women exchanged glances, half amused, half wary, the way people look at a magician whose trick is too good to be trusted. They had eaten turnip soup for so long that the memory of fat on their tongues felt almost indecent. Liesel's stomach gave a low growl. She swallowed it back, embarrassed, though there was no one here to impress. Only the guards in their khaki uniforms, rifles resting at casual angles. "Out you go," one of them called. The women climbed down one by one, skirts catching on the splintered edges. The camp stood before them, quiet and unnervingly neat. Rows of wooden barracks lined up like soldiers, the barbed wire fence glinting in the sun. Somewhere beyond the mess hall came the hiss of hot grease, the clatter of pans. It was as though they had stumbled onto the set of some strange play. Germany Starves performed in the theater of plenty. Liesel adjusted the scarf around her hair, suddenly aware of how travel-stained she must look. They had been captured weeks ago, plucked from the edges of battle like forgotten laundry. They had expected interrogation, punishment, hunger at the very least. Their mothers had told them stories of what Americans did to prisoners. Dark tales whispered in kitchens as bombs fell in the distance. Instead, here they were, standing in a place that smelled like a holiday breakfast. The sheer wrongness of it prickled at her skin. They were led to the barracks, past a vegetable patch where green shoots pushed through the earth. The camp smelled of earth and wood smoke, but always that meat. Each step felt like a challenge to their suspicions. Was this real? Was it bait in some elaborate trap? Marta kept muttering under her breath, half prayer, half curse. She had lost her brother at Stalingrad, lost her father to pneumonia the winter before. She carried grief like another organ in her body. For her, the smell of bacon was not comfort. It was insult, as if the world had no business being this generous while so much had been taken from her. Inside the barracks, light slanted through dusty windows, illuminating neatly made bunks. The women sat stiffly on the edges, afraid to relax, afraid to admit relief. Outside, a bell rang. A guard appeared at the door and said something in clipped German. Essen. Food. The mess hall was larger than they expected, with long wooden tables polished smooth by use. Steam curled from trays at the far end. The women moved forward slowly, as if approaching an altar. And then they saw it, platters of potatoes, bread so white it seemed to glow, and meat, thick slices of it, browned at the edges, glistening with fat. Liesel felt the air leave her lungs. She had not seen such food since 1939. Before the war had turned dinner into arithmetic, every gram counted, every bite rationed. The first mouthful was almost too much. The salt burned pleasantly against her tongue. The fat melted like butter. Around her, she heard muffled gasps, choked laughter. A few women wept silently, turning away to hide their faces. Even Marta, stone-faced Marta, chewed slowly, her eyes glistening with something that was not quite joy. For a brief moment, the room became something other than a prison. It became a memory of home, Christmas feasts, Sunday roasts, the world as it had been before the war carved it into pieces. And that was the most disorienting part. The enemy was feeding them like family. After the meal, the women wandered back to the barracks, some dazed, some talking in low, rapid voices. Liesel lay back on her bunk, staring at the wooden ceiling. The hunger that had been her constant companion was gone, replaced by a new sensation she could not name. It was not trust, not yet, but it was the first step toward something she had not felt in years, safety. Yet safety came with its own sharp edge. That night, as darkness fell over the camp, the women lay awake listening to the distant hum of trucks, the chirp of crickets. They thought of their mothers, their brothers, their bombed-out towns. Guilt curled in their bellies more stubbornly than any hunger had. They were eating meat while their families might be gnawing on stale bread, dodging air raids. Liesel turned on her side, clutching the thin blanket. She could still taste the meal on her tongue, sweet and rich. It felt like betrayal and salvation all at once. When she finally closed her eyes, she saw not the barbed wire, not the guards, but the glistening slice of meat on her plate, shining like a promise she did not yet understand. And far away, in a Europe still burning, someone was starving. Tomorrow there would be more food, more questions, more uneasy laughter. But tonight, in the strange stillness of an American prison camp, the war felt farther away than it ever had. And that, perhaps, was the most frightening thing of all. The next morning began with a whistle and the thud of boots on packed earth. The camp stirred to life, guards calling orders, cooks clanging metal pots like bells announcing a feast. Liesel woke to sunlight streaming through the narrow window and the sound of Marta cursing softly, tugging her hair into a braid. Another day in paradise, Marta said dryly, but her stomach betrayed her with a low rumble. The scent of coffee drifted in again, rich and black, and they both knew they would follow it no matter what waited on the other side of the mess hall door. At breakfast, the spread was as shocking as the night before. Eggs cooked until their yolks glowed like small suns. Bread so soft it left white smears on their fingers. Slabs of ham with fat that shimmered in the light. The women ate cautiously at first, as though someone might snatch it all away. The guard sat at a separate table but seemed unconcerned, laughing at some joke between them. This was the moment Liesel realized something that unsettled her more than the barbed wire ever could. This was not an accident. The food, the order, the strange gentleness of the routine. Someone had decided it should be this way. Later that day, they were gathered in the yard, where an interpreter, a German-American soldier with careful, formal speech, explained their situation. They were prisoners of war, he said, and they would remain here until the conflict ended or they were repatriated. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention, which meant fair rations, medical care, and humane treatment. The words sounded strange in Liesel's ears. In the Reich's papers, the Geneva Convention was often mocked as a relic of weak nations, yet here it was dictating their daily bread. That night in the barracks, the women talked in whispers. "It makes no sense," Marta said. "They should hate us. They should starve us." Her voice was edged with bitterness, but underneath was fear. If the Americans were not punishing them, then what did they want? The truth, though none of them could have known it yet, was that the Americans wanted many things at once. They wanted order, not chaos. They wanted their prisoners healthy enough to work, to avoid epidemics that might spread beyond the camp. They wanted to uphold the letter of the law, if only to ensure that captured American soldiers in Europe might be treated as well. And though it was rarely said aloud, they wanted to win hearts and minds. If not now, then someday when these women went home and told their stories. Even so, not all Americans were comfortable with this strange generosity. In the towns surrounding the camp, some locals grumbled that their own families were stretching ration coupons, skipping meat on Tuesdays and Fridays, while the enemy ate like farmhands after harvest. A few farmers sent letters to the papers, complaining that it was a disgrace to feed pork chops to women who had once worked for the Reich's war machine. Others, paradoxically, defended it, saying it was proof that America fought with honor. The women felt this tension without needing to read the papers. Sometimes, while working outside the camp, picking vegetables or clearing fields, they caught the looks of civilians, some curious, some cold. Children stared openly at their blonde hair and foreign clothes. A few waved. Once, an old woman approached with a basket of apples and left it at the fence without a word. The women shared them that night, crunching into the sweet flesh in silence, each lost in her thoughts. Liesel found herself watching the guards more closely. They were not cruel men, not in the way she had been warned. Most were farm boys, barely older than she was, who smoked cigarettes and spoke of home with a kind of lazy longing. She caught one of them humming as he walked the perimeter, a tune she recognized as American swing. The sound made her ache, though she could not have said why. Perhaps because it reminded her that they, too, were just young and far from home. Weeks passed, and the meals continued like clockwork. At first, the women hoarded bread crusts in their pockets, afraid the bounty would stop. When it did not, something in them began to loosen. Marta's cheeks filled out, and she no longer looked like a shadow of herself. The barracks began to smell of soap and clean laundry instead of unwashed fear. Even laughter returned, hesitant at first, then easier, spilling from the windows at night. But comfort came with a complicated price. The better they were treated, the more they thought of the families left behind. News from home came in censored letters, whole lines blacked out, but enough words bled through to tell of hunger, of bombing raids, of friends killed in the rubble. Each letter was a wound that their full plates could not heal. Guilt became the new hunger, eating at them in the quiet hours. One evening after supper, Liesel lingered in the mess hall, staring at the half-empty platters. The American cook, a grizzled man with a face like sun-baked leather, noticed her hesitation. "Go on, take some," he said, his accent thick but kind. "Tomorrow's more where that came from." She nodded, though her throat felt tight, and took the slice of meat he offered. Back in the barracks, she divided it with Marta, though neither of them was truly hungry. They ate it anyway, chewing slowly, as if by eating they could keep despair from taking root. What unnerved Liesel most was how quickly her body adapted to plenty. Within a month, the gnawing hunger that had defined her for years had dulled, and with it came a dangerous sense of safety. The war felt distant now, muffled by full bellies and predictable days. And yet, she knew it was still raging somewhere over the ocean, claiming lives with every hour. That knowledge sat in her chest like a stone. As summer deepened, the camp grew familiar, almost ordinary. The guards' faces became known, the rhythm of work and meals steady as the turning of a wheel. The women began to wonder what would become of them after the war, whether they would be sent home to ruins or kept here in limbo. They did not say it aloud, but some part of them feared the day their captivity would end. One sweltering afternoon, as they returned from a day's labor, they saw something new tacked to the camp notice board. A sheet of paper with typed words in German. The interpreter read it aloud, an announcement that more prisoners were arriving soon, hundreds of them, men from the front. The women exchanged uneasy looks. Their fragile island of strange mercy was about to change. And Liesel, standing there with dust on her hands and the sun in her eyes, felt the first tremor of something that might be fear, or something darker. Whatever came next, she knew it would not be simple. The camp lived by a rhythm that soon became as familiar as a heartbeat. At dawn the bell rang, its sharp clang bouncing off the barracks walls, calling the women from uneasy sleep. The air smelled of wet earth, dew clinging to the grass, and somewhere in the distance came the metallic hiss of the mess hall griddle, already alive with heat. Liesel rose with the others, her bare feet hitting the cool floor, and tied her hair back with the same careful motion she used each morning. The war outside the fence might have been chaos, but inside there was a strange order, as if the Americans were determined to tame the very shape of their days. Breakfast was the same dazzling spectacle. Eggs steaming, coffee poured into metal mugs, bread stacked in high white towers. What had once felt like an insult now became ritual. Marta sat across from Liesel, tearing her toast with a concentration that was almost reverent. "Do you ever feel guilty?" she asked one morning, so quietly it was nearly swallowed by the hum of conversation. Liesel hesitated, the question settling like dust in her mind. Of course she felt guilty. Every bite tasted of home and hunger at once. But she only said, "Yes. And I keep eating." After breakfast, work details were assigned. The women filed out through the gates, watched by guards with rifles slung loose across their shoulders. They were sent to local farms to harvest beans, to cut wheat, to mend fences. Tasks that reminded them of summers before the war, when work meant life and not survival. The Kansas sky stretched huge and cloudless above them, a dome of blue so wide it felt like it could swallow Europe whole. It was on one of these work days that Liesel first met Mrs. Gardner, the farmer's wife whose land lay just beyond the camp. She was a stout woman with sun-reddened arms and a face lined by years of prairie wind. She did not speak German, but she pressed a dipper of water into Liesel's hands and pointed to the shade of the barn with a brusque nod. Liesel drank greedily, water running down her chin. For a moment their eyes met, two women, both weary in different ways, and something passed between them that needed no translation. Back in the camp that night, the women shared their impressions. Some laughed about the strange slang the guards used. Others mimicked the country music that played faintly on the radio near the gatehouse. Even Marta, who still carried grief like an extra limb, allowed herself a wry smile at the memory of a farm dog that had stolen a loaf of bread right out of a guard's hand. These moments were small, but they stitched themselves into the fabric of their captivity, turning survival into something almost bearable. Yet the camp was not without its shadows. New arrivals brought fresh stories from the front. Stories of bombed cities, burned fields, fathers and brothers dead or missing. Each tale was another stone on the pile of guilt they all carried. At night, the barracks glowed faintly from the lanterns, and whispered conversations stretched long into the darkness. Liesel often lay awake, staring at the wooden beams above her head, listening to the breathing of the others. Safety, she was learning, could be its own torment. The camp itself seemed designed to both contain and soothe them. There were gardens planted between the barracks, bright with marigolds and beans. There was a small library stocked with English books, which the women struggled to read aloud, laughing at their mispronunciations. Sometimes there was music, a guard with a harmonica, a prisoner with a guitar fashioned from scrap wood. The sound floated over the wire at dusk, mingling with the smell of supper until the whole camp felt suspended in an impossible peace. One afternoon, a truck arrived with supplies, and with it came a group of male prisoners, sunburned, hollow-eyed, fresh from the Atlantic crossing. The women watched from the barracks yard as the men were marched inside. Some of them looked away, ashamed to be seen in captivity by countrywomen. Others stared openly, as if the sight of the women anchored them to the world again. That night, the camp felt different, charged with a new energy. Liesel could hear low voices from the men's compound, laughter that sounded almost defiant. Days turned into weeks, and the women began to gain weight, their cheeks filling out, their hair regaining its shine. The guards noticed too, making offhand remarks about how the prisoners were healthier than some of the townsfolk. Marta, once gaunt and hollow-eyed, now moved with something close to her old confidence. But with every new sign of life came a reminder of what waited beyond the camp. Letters arrived less frequently, and when they did, they spoke of hunger and ruin. One evening, Marta received a letter with black censor lines slicing through the page like knife cuts. She read it twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it under her pillow. Liesel did not ask what it said. Despite the fences, a strange intimacy grew between prisoners and guards. There were moments when the war seemed to dissolve, if only for a heartbeat. A guard passing a cigarette through the wire, a prisoner offering to fix a broken tool, both sides speaking in halting fragments of each other's languages. Liesel found herself looking for these moments, as if they might explain why the enemy could treat them like human beings when their own country had treated prisoners so differently. One evening, just before sunset, the women were called to the yard. The sky was a blaze of gold and crimson, the heat of the day finally softening. The camp commandant stood waiting, a paper in his hand, his face unreadable. He cleared his throat and read aloud. There would be changes to the work schedule, new rules about correspondence, stricter curfews. The war in Europe was entering its final phase, he said, and there were security concerns. The words landed like stones in the still air. For months, the camp had been their strange sanctuary, a place of barbed wire but also bread, of guards but also music. Now, for the first time, they felt the ground shifting beneath them. As they were dismissed, Liesel lingered a moment longer, staring at the sun sinking beyond the fence. The sky looked like fire on the horizon, and she could not shake the feeling that it was a warning. Something was coming that would change everything again, and this time, she feared, no amount of meat or mercy would soften its edge. The numbers came first in rumor, then in whispers, then as stark black and white facts posted on the camp notice board. Every prisoner had gained weight, some by 10 pounds, some by 20, and the army had kept careful records of each measurement as though charting the growth of a strange new crop. Liesel stared at the sheet tacked to the wall, her own name on it, her weight neatly recorded. She felt exposed, as if the Americans now knew not just what she weighed, but how far she had come from the hunger-bitten girl who had stepped off the truck. Around her, the other women studied their numbers with mixed expressions, some proud, some ashamed, some quietly pleased that they had proof their bodies were no longer hollowed by scarcity. At supper that evening, the conversation turned sharp. Marta poked at her plate of stew with her spoon, her brow furrowed. "We are getting fat while they are starving," she said flatly, nodding toward the letter she had received the week before, its ink still smudged from the tears she had shed. "My mother wrote that they stand in line 3 hours for a crust of bread. And here, look at this. Meet again." She said it like an accusation. Liesel swallowed hard. The stew was rich, the broth dark and fragrant with beef fat. It no longer startled her, this abundance, but it still carried a sting of guilt that caught her at odd moments, like stepping barefoot on a hidden thorn. "Would starving yourself help her?" she asked gently, but Marta only scowled. Later that night, the guard's radio played softly from the gatehouse, American voices announcing news from Europe. The Allies were advancing. German cities were falling one by one, and with each name read aloud, Cologne, Kassel, Frankfurt, the women felt a quiet shudder pass through the barracks. Some of them had families in those cities. Some had nothing left to go back to. Yet here they were, gaining weight, growing healthier by the week. The cruel irony gnawed at them all. One morning, the camp cook, wiping his hands on his apron, chuckled to himself as he looked over the delivery manifest. "More beef this month than last," he said in slow, accented German. "You girls eat better than I do." The comment rippled through the room. It was meant as a joke, but it landed like a confession. They were consuming more calories than many civilians in Britain, more than even some American families on tight rations. The statistics proved it. The army kept track of everything: pounds of flour delivered, barrels of milk consumed, livestock slaughtered. The women heard that over 1 million pounds of meat were being served to prisoners across the country every month. The number was so vast it felt unreal, a thing too big to imagine, and yet here was the proof on their plates. As the days passed, small tensions began to surface. Some of the male prisoners grumbled that the women received slightly better treatment, an extra ladle of soup, an easier work assignment. The guards denied it, but the whispers persisted. The women ignored them at first, but when an officer shouted at them for laughing too loudly one evening, Liesel sensed the atmosphere shifting. The camp was not the safe island it had once been. It was a container under pressure, and the pressure was rising. Still, there were moments of absurd humor. One afternoon, after a delivery of fresh chickens, Marta announced dryly, "I think they are trying to send us home fat, so the ruins will look worse by comparison." The barracks erupted in laughter, the sound half hysterical, half true. It was a joke, yes, but beneath it lay the uneasy sense that the Americans had their reasons for keeping them well fed, and those reasons might have nothing to do with kindness. The weight of the statistics pressed on Liesel's mind more than she expected. Numbers had a way of making things undeniable. She could no longer pretend she was merely surviving. She was thriving, and that knowledge carried its own burden. At night, she lay awake listening to the night insects singing beyond the fence, her body heavy and warm from supper. She wondered what her father would think if he saw her now, with rounder cheeks and strong arms, living behind barbed wire, but healthier than he had been in years. As autumn crept in, the meals grew heartier. Stews thick with root vegetables, roasts that filled the mess hall with the smell of pepper and browned fat. The women's faces glowed from the warmth, their hands chapped from work in the fields, but there was life in their eyes again. And still the letters trickled in, telling of hunger, of neighbors wasting away, of children fainting in schoolrooms. Every letter was like a stone tossed into still water, sending ripples through the fragile calm they had built. Then came the announcement that changed everything. A memo arrived from higher command, read aloud by the interpreter. Ration levels might soon be cut, not because supplies were running out, but because public complaints had reached Washington. There were citizens who resented that prisoners were eating steak while they were stretching meat coupons and lining up for butter. There was pressure to scale back, to remind everyone that this was still a war. The news sent a murmur through the camp. Some of the women were relieved, as though the moral scales might finally tip back toward balance. Others were frightened. What if the cuts were severe? What if this fragile abundance vanished overnight and hunger came creeping back like an old ghost? That night, the mess hall was quieter than usual. The stew was the same as always, but it tasted different, sharper, tinged with the knowledge that it might soon be gone. Marta finished her bowl and set it down with a decisive clatter. "Let them cut it," she said. "At least then we will feel the war again." But Liesel said nothing. She was staring at the notice board, where a new sheet of paper had been tacked up beside the weight records. It was a list of names, volunteers for a new work program outside the camp. One that promised extra pay in camp scrip, maybe even more food. Her own name was not on the list. Not yet, but she felt the pull of it, the sense that something beyond the wire was calling, something that might either break her or change her forever. Winter came with a hush so deep it seemed to swallow sound. The Kansas wind scoured the barracks walls, rattling them like bones, and the women drew closer to the iron stove in the center of the room. The air smelled of smoke and wool and something else, roast pork drifting from the mess hall, thick as memory. Liesel sat on the edge of her bunk, her hands curled in her lap. It was almost Christmas, and she should have felt grateful for the feast waiting outside, but all she could think of was home. Her mother counting ration coupons, her father's empty chair, the neighbor boy buried after the last air raid. The guilt pressed down like another layer of winter. Marta stood at the window, staring through the frost at the fence beyond. "They say the war may end soon," she murmured. "They say we may go home." Her voice was flat, unreadable, as if the thought of returning to a ruined country was not a promise but a sentence. She turned to Liesel. What do we go back as? Prisoners? Survivors? Fat women who ate American meat while our families starved. Liesel flinched but didn't look away. She had asked herself the same thing each night before sleep, lying in the warmth of a full stomach. Maybe we go back as proof, she said slowly, tasting the words as if they were fragile. Proof that we were not broken. The camp prepared for Christmas with an almost feverish energy. The guards strung makeshift decorations in the mess hall, and a tree was cut from a nearby wood and set up in the yard. The women were given extra sugar rations, cocoa, even a few precious oranges. The feast on Christmas Eve was the grandest yet. Hams glazed with mustard, potatoes mashed with butter so rich they glistened, pies that steamed when cut. The mess hall was warm and bright, the air so full of smells it was dizzying. But under the surface, a restlessness ran through the room like a current. Every woman there knew the war was moving toward its end, that soon the strange cocoon of the camp would be broken open. Some smiled too brightly, others sat in silence, chewing slowly as though memorizing the taste. Marta raised her cup of coffee in a bitter little toast. To the last meal before we remember what hunger feels like, she said, and several of the women laughed, though the sound was tight and thin. That night, as snow began to fall outside, Liesel could not sleep. She rose quietly, pulling her coat around her, and stepped into the yard. The sky was white with snow, the world muffled and strange. At the far end of the compound, the guard's radio played faintly, a man's voice announcing news in English she could not fully understand, but whose tone was unmistakable. Victory was coming. She walked toward the fence, her boots crunching in the snow, until she could see the guard on duty. He looked up, startled, but did not raise his rifle. After a moment, he offered her a cigarette through the wire. She took it, though she had never smoked before, and the warmth filled her chest as she exhaled into the night. In that quiet moment, with the snow falling between them, she understood something she could not have named months earlier. The Americans had fed them not just to keep them alive but to make a point. That mercy could be a weapon, that kindness could shape a prisoner as surely as cruelty. They had turned meat into a message, one she would carry with her when she stepped back into Germany's ruins. By spring, the orders came. The war in Europe was ending. The prisoners would be sent home. The camp buzzed with a nervous energy, women packing the few belongings they had gathered, trading scrip for chocolate and soap, writing last letters to the guards they had befriended. The final meal was served the night before departure. Roast beef, potatoes, gravy thick enough to coat the spoon. It was as though the Americans wanted to send them off with one last taste of the strange abundance that had defined their captivity. Liesel sat at the table long after she had finished eating, her hand resting on the wood. Marta was beside her, her face pale but resolute. Tomorrow, Marta said softly. Tomorrow we go back to whatever is left. Liesel nodded. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing against her ribs, the knowledge that she would never sit in this room again, never smell bacon curling in the morning air, never taste coffee this strong or meat this plentiful. The camp had been a prison, yes, but it had also been a place of rebirth. She was no longer the girl who had stumbled off the truck months ago, hollow-eyed and afraid. She was heavier now, not just in body but in spirit, carrying the memory of every meal like a talisman. When dawn came, they lined up by the gate, snow melting in the early sun. The trucks waited, engines rumbling. As the women climbed aboard, Liesel turned once to look back. The camp stood silent, smoke rising from the kitchen chimney, the fence glinting in the light. For a moment she thought she could still smell the meat, rich and sweet, hanging in the cold air like a blessing or a curse. As the truck jolted forward, she pressed her hand to her stomach, feeling the fullness there, the strange strength it gave her. She did not know what waited on the other side of the ocean, but she knew this. She would carry the memory of those meals like a secret weapon, a reminder that even in captivity she had been fed, she had been kept whole. And when she stepped off the ship into a country broken by war, she would bring that wholeness with her, like a spark struck in the dark, refusing to go out. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.